Well, that is a great segue because I actually will be welcoming on stage Eric Redding from Abt Associates, their Chief Climate Officer, and Jennifer Sara, who is the Global Director for Change at the World Bank. So, Eric, I'm glad I'm having to watch myself on the big screen today.
Very embarrassing.
Thank you both for joining us. So we were just talking. You both are very new to your roles, right? I think you both started in July. And I think that's indicative of really it being new that our development sector is recognizing how important climate is and impacts everything we do. Eric, you are the first Chief Climate Officer at Abt. It's a new role you all created. It's not one that you see at all development organizations, but it's one you're starting to see more. Could you talk a little bit about why Abt created this role and how you see that fitting into the overall objectives of Abt?
Sure, absolutely. So at Apt, we've done climate work for quite some time, but we really saw the importance of climate to our clients around the world expanding tremendously. Whether it was the U.S. government, which had a great epiphany about climate 2 years ago, or the Australian government or others, the level of importance of climate on the agenda, not only programming in climate, but also integration of climate across the portfolio is incredibly important. So the creation of this chief climate officer role works across the global development business, which I previously was responsible for at Apt, as well as our domestic consulting work and our work in Australia and the UK, and really pulls climate as a thread across all of that, looks to integrate climate into the work that we're doing, for example, with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as they look at public housing and the resilience to climate. These are really critical issues that are being looked at from a lot of different lenses. So that integration of climate across sectors is something that we really need to increase the organization's ability to work in a multidisciplinary way to do that, as well as the rapid expansion of the work that we're doing that is explicitly climate.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think a lot of the funding that goes to development is very siloed, and as a result, many organizations create their departments around these silos to respond to the funding. You work a lot with USAID and other US government funders. How are you seeing that change, and how is it changing the way you approach your work, whether it's health or food, where obviously climate is so integrated in that, but we don't see necessarily climate specific funding?
Yeah. So it varies tremendously. I mean, we're working with a lot of existing projects that weren't designed with climate in mind to determine how to drive climate more deeply into that project. In some cases, that's demanded by the client who is saying we're really looking to drive this agenda and we want to do it. In other places, we're seeing the opportunities and we're saying, here's a way that we could take this agriculture project and really focus on climate smart agriculture instead of just improving farmer incomes. In other places, the programs are explicitly designed to cut across sectors. For example, we're just launching a new program that's working on solar electrification of 10,000 health facilities across Africa. There are about 100,000 health facilities in Africa that are either unpowered or underpowered. So USAID is committed to electrifying 10,000 of them in a way that's not using diesel generators or not using coal-fired power plants, because as the health sectors develop around the world, it represents about 18% of power consumption. And bringing that online with clean energy not only improves healthcare, but also helps to decarbonize the health sector. So we're seeing the combination of kind of retrofitting as well as programs that are being designed to use health money, in a climate-friendly way. And I think that's a great development that's happening today.
And Jennifer, we were talking about the fact the World Bank for the first time has its own pavilion here at COP. It's obviously a much bigger part of what the World Bank is focused on. You are new to this role. It's not a brand new role at the bank. But how are you all thinking about, and particularly you step into this position recently, your first COP in this role, thinking about how you integrate climate across all of that the bank is focused on?
So thanks. Yeah, I actually started this job on July 1st. I was the global director for water for the last 8 years. So it's interesting from moving to the water space, and we know adaptation is all about water management, into the climate space. And so the World Bank's always been very active in all the COPs, but we always had pavilions with other MDBs. And this year we said we're going to go for it and have our own World Bank group pavilion. And I think it's also because, as soon as after the Paris alignment, we launched our first climate change action plan within the bank. And so we had implemented that for the first 5 years. And now we're at the Climate Change Action Plan 2.0, as we call it. In the first CCAP, we really started like spreading climate across the bank into everything we did. And during those 5 years, kind of infiltrating ongoing investments in a lot of ways and informing new ones, we ended up having about 90% of all of our World Bank projects that delivered some kind of climate benefits. But now when we take to the current plan, Climate Change Action 2.0, I mean, it's great because I just joined when we get to mainstream climate into every single thing we do. So climate and development is part of the DNA, and we have to make it part of everyone's DNA across the whole World Bank group. And it really is a point of inflection and a point of excitement. And we're going to do that because we're going to align all of our financial flows with the Paris Agreement. And it's really important for us to understand what's happening in every country. Every country is really different. And so we've launched these brand new analytical pieces called the Climate Change Development Reports that really go into deep modeling and analytical, working with countries to look at what a low carbon emissions pathway could be, and also building resilience into their development agenda, because I think that's important to always remember climate and development go together. Last year, in terms of ramping up our financing, it was great. We're able to deliver $31.7 billion of climate finance, and 50% of that was in adaptation. So that's great in terms of numbers. The Paris alignment, do sound analytics, think of countries, and then deliver the financing. And I think I want to just come back to the CCDRs because it's really important. I mean, when you do a deep dive into China, it's going to be very different than when you do the deep dive into Sahel and what their needs are. And I think in the climate space, we always have to remember we have differentiated responsibilities. I mean, the high-income countries, the high emitters, have to start reducing emissions, but also help the poor countries. I think that's important. And also in the poor countries, we have to understand that's where the impact is hitting the most, the adaptation. It's hardest for them to respond to this. But I think what's important is that our analysis shows it's not all doomsday. We can deliver climate and development. It's not huge incremental costs. The relative costs are huge in the Sahel compared to China, let's say, but it is doable. And I think having that sound analysis is really important. So I really think that whole, like you're saying, how do you actually, it's no longer retrofitting. It's a change of mindset. It's a change of the way you start looking at any dialogue, any operation. It's not just a small team of people on the side. It's every single person, every country director, anyone who engages with government and with our partners to say, hey, you know what, climate change is here, it's real. How do we help you to achieve your development impact? You lower emissions in a low emissions way, and also build the adaptation resilience as you do that.
So yesterday at an event that Bloomberg hosted, John Kerry was speaking, and he said that we needed massive reform to multilateral development banks by the spring World Bank meetings in order to hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. What would you say to that, and how are you thinking about internally how you reorganize yourself to just be able to better address what are massive gaps in climate finance?
So, I mean, we're actually super happy that everyone's paying attention to the MDBs because we actually do think that there's an opportunity just for all work together and also leverage much more funding. So if we had more funding coming our way as well, and how we could deliver greater impact. And that comes to climate finance. And I think we're going to be able to deliver impact at scale when we think that we have to understand that climate finance, there will be part of it that will be concessional money in some lending, hopefully also to help risk share with some much needed private investment, but there is going to be a grant funding as well. So we need to look at a package of how do you look at grant funding that can be combined in a very systematic way. So the important thing is we take the analytical basis of a CCDR, we work with governments for them to own and develop their long-term strategies. How are we going to develop and get to where we need to go? Taking into account our low emissions trajectory that we're planning to achieve, looking at what the priorities, how much it costs, and how do you design impactful programs and projects? And then you crowd in the financing around these specific objectives. And you need to do that blend. You need to understand where do you put in the concessional money, where do you put in the grants, and where do you put in the private sector money? Now, I think it's clear for the IDA countries, the poorer countries, there's a good understanding of that. I think sometimes when the middle income countries, right, the Perus of the world, the Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, you have huge pockets of poverty, right? And so these are countries that also right now are fiscally strapped. I mean, they've been hit by COVID, they've been hit by one thing, the impact of the Ukraine war is just affecting everyone, right? So they're already fiscally strapped, and to ask them to even borrow at concessional rates is expensive for them. So how do we actually now think to reform the MDBs? Could there be windows, these special windows of lower cost money that could be combined with the slightly more expensive money for very specific purposes? So we're excited about this conversation. We're a part of it because we think it's important for us to reform together from inside and outside, all working together with our shareholders. So yeah.
Okay. And tomorrow I'll actually be interviewing for our podcast. So again, plug for the podcast for Creating This Week. Jillian Caldwell, who's the Chief Climate Officer at USAID, also a newer position for them. Eric, as a partner of USAID, what has been your impression of how they've integrated climate into their programming and also aligning that with this localization agenda that is also front and center?
Yeah, I think USAID has really made remarkable progress if you look across the U.S. government and how that is changing across the U.S. government today. USAID made a very deliberate climate strategy that they launched for comment at the last COP in Glasgow, and has really been marching towards implementing that strategy. And you're seeing climate showing up more and deeper in the programming that they're moving to. And they're doing that without any new climate funding. They haven't gotten a budget passed through Congress to bring new climate money. So they're doing it with Feed the Future money, they're doing it with health money, they're doing it with disaster money, and aligning those funding streams with the climate agenda. And I think USAID is really remarkable because of some of the political winds that have pushed in different directions over the years at making these alignments of different streams of money with important things on the development agenda. So I think we're seeing that very rapid transition. Now, as new money comes in, that could maybe get more ambitious, but being able to use existing funding streams and do that is a pretty huge bureaucratic feat that I think they're succeeding at.
And so, Jennifer, you have a large team here on the ground at COP. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? Are you feeling hopeful from the conversations you've been having so far? You mentioned you're happy to see more attention maybe on the MDBs. What has been your takeaway from I think we've been saying each day at COP feels like a week. So
I got here Saturday. I feel like I've been here a month.
COP years.
No, I mean, I'm super excited. I've been in this business, we call it a business. I started as a Peace Corps volunteer when I started my career in development, right? So I get out of bed. I'm an eternal optimist. I have to be. I really, really, really care deeply about development. I care about our planet. I'm also an environmental engineer, and that was an oxymoron in the 1980s. Like, how can you be an engineer and talk about environment? They don't go together. So I think climate and development for me is that. And I think with climate change is really interesting because in water space, it's also a global public good that unfortunately many people don't deal with well. And it gets polluted. But when water gets polluted, you can see it, you can smell it, it's gross, right? Maybe people will take action about it. But the thing with climate change, these greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere, methane, carbon dioxide, people just don't see them, right? And the people emitting them. So it's a very more difficult thing to bring and galvanize global attention around it. I think that's important because you need to bring it down to people to have them make decisions. And what's not fair is that, climate change impacts us all, but it doesn't impact us all equally. And so I think trying to tease out a message to action. I love this COP. It's about implementations of actions about Africa, right? And that's what I think. I think we really need to move in that direction when we stop pointing fingers at each other, who's not doing enough, who needs to do more. But let's just celebrate the successes that we do see and bring the voices of the countries most impacted also to the stage. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the implementation COP. Eric, you are leading a group that really focuses on implementation. You're on the ground. How are you thinking about engaging more these local partners so that they are more leading some of these action items that you're working on?
Yeah, it's a good question because, as we work with our local partners around the world, they're often very specialized in the area that they're focused on, and they're not necessarily widening the aperture to look at how does agriculture fit into environment or how does healthcare fit into environment. So bringing those local partners along and helping them understand, often providing technical assistance to local partners in what do interventions of climate smart agriculture look like? These are the kinds of things that we as development implementers can bring to that equation, and that's going to stick. These are the organizations that are working with the ministries of agriculture, the Ministry of Health, in country forever. They're going to be there working forever, and as we strengthen their ability to integrate climate into the work that they do, we're strengthening that whole local system. And I think that's really critical as we're doing that. And in many places, it's a new conversation that at that ground implementation level, climate just hasn't been a factor that you're thinking about. You're single-mindedly looking at that stovepipe of water or of energy or of agriculture or health.
I mean, can I just jump in? I think that's exactly true. I mean, I'm struggling. We're trying to mainstream. We're going to mainstream climate change into the World Bank Group, into everything we do. But you're right. It's at the country level, and the challenge is really, you're mainstreaming it, and that, and it is with the decision makers as well across the silos, breaking down the silos. And I think working together and never forgetting that at the end of the day, that's where we're working, is at that in the countries, right?
This agriculture program that you saw on screen, it was an amazingly interesting story because we actually started driving climate into that project when we had a group of Egyptian agribusinesses visiting the U.S. for a study tour. And we decided to take that opportunity of them being there to really look for opportunities to drive climate more deeply into this program, which was already operational. And it was actually the chairperson of the largest tomato processor in Egypt who really brought the issue home for everyone and said, I lost 2 months of my factory's production because we had a cold snap in the southern part of Egypt, which has never had a freeze before. He said, climate change is real and it's affecting my business in a dramatic way. Anybody who's ever been involved in manufacturing knows that closing your factory for 2 months because your raw material is not available is a huge, huge financial cost to a business. And we looked at that. We looked at opportunities to help to shift varietals in that area that were more resilient to temperature. We also looked at things like their waste stream, which was already a commodity that they were selling. But as the businesses looked at it, they realized that they could be extracting the methane from their waste stream of pressed tomatoes, using that biogas that's produced to replace the natural gas that they were buying at a huge cost. And that had an economic efficiency to it for the company. And that interest from the private sector actually drove more interest in this resilient agribusiness and issues of methane within the government. And that's enormous when that happens.
Yeah, and your early point makes me think of adaptation. And we held an event a few weeks ago in London on development finance and discussed that, particularly when we talk to low and middle income countries, what they want is financing for adaptation. They're saying, it's here, it's happening, we need help now. Yet most of the financing is going more to mitigation. So, Jennifer, do you think about that at the bank and balancing those?
No, I think it's critical. And again, 50% of our money goes to adaptation, to combine with mitigation, and it's really important. We think everyone else should be moving in that direction. But adaptation, again, comes back, it's adaptation with development impact. And I think that's important. So people are looking for, they need water. I'll go back to the water because that's my safe space, in the sense that, water is really, water storage is critical for adaptation. And water storage are not just big, large reservoirs. These, it could be nature-based solutions, it could be groundwater, it could be small rainwater catchment. So people need water, and adaptation really is water management in many ways, too much and too little. So I think when you think about adaptation, you provide water for irrigation. You're providing water for drinking. You're providing water to pastoralists. So you're making sure that you're providing adaptation as you deliver the development benefits with communities, with governments. You think of water secure cities. You have to think of water secure industries. And it's not some water, I'm saying it could be, so it's resilient and adaptive industry. So I think that you need to think about you don't lose your growth and development objective. You need to create jobs, you need economic growth, but you build the adaptive capacity within the project as you're doing it. And so I think one thing that's important, we're working a lot on, is measurement. Everyone's always measuring, and even just measuring how much you're paying the inflows, right? We're now doing co-benefits. And that itself is a challenge, because how do you tease out what's adaptation and what's like what you would do anyway? So that's been, there's a huge industry, important one, of measuring that, but we need to put the impact. What is it, the transformational changes that you need to make, and what's the additional cost and delta of that, I think. So adaptation is Very, very important.
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of attention on small island developing states recently, and particularly our work with the Australian government really focuses on island states in the Pacific. And this issue of where do you invest in your development, uh, and how resilient is that is a huge question, particularly for island states. Because if you look at an island state, Fiji or Barbados or something like that, most of that infrastructure that's been invested in over 100, 200 years is all along the coastlines. Whether you're talking about your energy infrastructure or your water or your schools or your hospitals, it's right along the coastlines. It's vulnerable to storms. It's 3, 4 feet above sea level. As you get sea level rise, as you get more intense storms, that vulnerability is tremendous. And still today, as you said, more than 90% of our climate finance dollars are going to mitigation, not adaptation. And even within that 90%, Abt actually just released a white paper this morning that 98% of it is going to clean energy and only 2% to methane reduction, even though methane, according to the analysis that we've done, has a 60 times greater impact on society. The economic return is 60 times greater on methane mitigation. So we're seeing tremendous flows into clean energy for obvious reasons. Energy is important. It's a very investable place. But in that mitigation area of methane, which is responsible for more than half of climate change, or almost half of climate change, and within adaptation, we're just not seeing enough climate finance dollars yet.
Can I just build on? I mean, you gave that example from the small island states about the coastal erosion. So we're doing a lot of programs on that as well. And in West Africa, we have a West Africa coastal erosion, and it goes from Senegal all the way down through to Nigeria. It's called Waka. But what's really interesting is it's about adaptation, but it's delivering huge development impacts coming back to that. So up in San Luis in Senegal a few years ago, because there was a coastal erosion prevention program and try to recover some of it, but also with nature-based solutions and mangroves, all of a sudden there's a whole hotel industry that used to be there that was losing all of its clients because the beaches were disappearing. It's back, it's thriving, it's growing. So that was like a good example where you have adaptation is really good for businesses as well and for development. So I just wanted to piggyback, because small island states is the same thing. They're huge tourism places as well.
Great. Well, I could spend all day talking to you, but I know we are coming to the end of our time. But thank you so much, Eric and Jennifer.
Thanks, Kate.
Great, thanks.